What is up, everybody? It's Dr. Vibe here, host and producer of the award winning Dr. Vibe show. As always, I like to say you're blessed, highly favored, a magnet for miracles, and a solution for someone's problem. Remember, it's a host of Epic Conversations here, and this is a place for Epic Conversations. And just remember, too, I was the 2018 Innovation Award winner given out by the Canadian Ethnic Media Association. For those who watch or listen to me frequently or once in a while, I always like to have new friends come on the Dr. Vibe show. And we have another new friend tonight, though we've been following each other on Twitter for a few years, but we finally said let's get this happening. So let me just share a little bit about this wonderful young gentleman. David Lewis Peart is an educator, community worker, consultant, writer, and playwright. He completed graduate studies at York University in Toronto and holds a diploma in human services counseling, mental health, and addictions from George Brown College. He has been a member of the faculty in both child and youth care and social work diploma programs in Toronto and Oakville, and was most recently an instructor with and one of the learning coordinators for the Niche program, a social service pathway training for Black youth and existing practitioners, a joint initiative between the CEE Center for Young Black Professionals, and actually I was there last night with Kofi Hope and
Okay.
Harriet Tubman Community Organization, funded through the City of Toronto. He's also a lead on the African Caribbean Black ACB Family Group Conferencing (FGC) project through the University of Toronto, funded by the Law Foundation of Ontario. Responsible for designing a culturally appropriate restorative justice intervention for African Canadian families involved with the child welfare system. As a writer, he is at the Obsidian Theatre Company 2018 19 Playwrights Unit Fellow and a recipient of the Christopher Hewitt Award for Poetry Honorable Mention. He is the founder of the Queer Men of Color Arts Collective, We Other Sons, which is presently undergoing a residency with Buddies in Bad Times Theatre. He has regularly contributed to publications such as CBC Arts, Huffington Post Canada, which we'll get into a little bit tonight, and byblacks.com. And tonight we're going to be chatting about Black masculinity. And welcome, David. Thank you so much for taking time in your positive schedule. How are you?
I'm all right. Thank
Good.
you.
How's the day been?
Full. It's been full.
After that bio, if your days aren't full, then I think that bio does not do you justice if your days
Oh, my
aren't.
word. My word.
Well, this is good. And again, thank you. I know you have a lot of meaningful, positive things going on. So I appreciate you taking the time to share with us. As always, with new friends on the Dr. Vibe show, can you share a little bit of the younger David days? We know what you've been doing now, but where you grew up, life growing up, etc.
Okay. I'm from Toronto, born and raised. I grew up in the St. Clair and Vaughan area as a younger person. My family's from Jamaica originally. And for a time, I lived in the care system. And so I was a former child in uh, Children's Aid Society. Um, and yeah, I grew up in Toronto and sort of cut my teeth here and ended up getting into community work and social service work, mental health, because of some of my experiences in the care system. And yeah, spent the last maybe 15, 16 years working with children, youth, and family in a number of different capacities. And then most recently doing education, so teaching and consulting. And now I do a contract with the City of Toronto and do work around anti-Black racism with the Confronting Anti-Black Racism unit, um, and then freelance, like Huffington Post.
Nice. Can you revert back to the days being in the care system? What memories, if any, do you have of those times? And I know probably they were not always pleasant.
Um, yeah, so I was in the care system from about 10 to 14,
Right.
and had a very sort of challenged home experience that eventually had to have me placed. I was a society ward, is what they would call it. And for a time, I sort of bounced around from group home to group home and foster home to foster home. And I would say, as much as it sounds like a bit of a sob story, and there were definitely moments where it wasn't as pleasant, I found my time there to be really helpful. Um, I had a lot of opportunities that were provided through my time there that wouldn't have been given to me had I stayed at home. Um, and I credit some of the folks that I met there, some of the child and youth care workers that I engaged with, and family service workers that I had, for really helping to get me right and back on my feet. Um, and I wouldn't really have been involved in the kind of work that I've been able to be involved with had it not been for that kind of intervention in my life. I would have ended up, I think, in a lot of ways, the statistics that so many young people who engage in a multitude of systems, whether it be child welfare, or mental health, or criminal justice, end up in. So, yeah, it wasn't the most idyllic, but it really did save me in a lot of ways. And so it wasn't all bad.
Okay. When did you realize that child welfare would be part of your passion, part of your journey?
Um, like I said, I had some really great workers
Yeah.
who, and some not so good ones. And both of them, I think, helped sort of usher me into doing this work. And so I sort of made a personal commitment to myself to not be like some of the crappy workers that I saw in my time, and then to follow in the footsteps of some of the really amazing ones, and some of whom were Black men.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, like that was, I think, my first. I wanted to give back in the ways that I felt like I had received them and poured into. And so, yeah.
Did when you decided to go this route, did anyone provide pushback or say, you know what, we don't know if you're doing the right thing. Like, look at what you've been through. Why are you going to go into something that provide you with some challenging moments in your journey?
I think the only sort of not so awesome feedback that I got early into my studies was some from family. Some of my older brothers were a little wary about me going into like social services. Like, what's like what? There's no money in that. There's no future in that. Um, and then for some of my supervisors, I remember doing a placement when I was in college and having a really horrible placement experience. And one of my placement supervisors um, essentially saying to me that, this was not the line of work for me, that I should go about finding another kind of employment journey and career journey. He said in not so nice words before kicking me out of that placement. And I'm sorry?
Kicking you out of the
He kicked me out of the placement. He kicked me out of the placement. Um, and it took me an extra year to complete my studies. I had worked all through college, and I was living on my own at the time and had my own challenges. And so, for a time I was like, maybe he's right. Maybe I'm not the best suited for this kind of work. But thankfully, again, had some like really amazing people who poured into me and encouraged me and were like, finish, David, finish and give back in whatever way it is that you feel called to. And so I'm thankful for those folks who just like held me and were like, don't let a few critics sort of end your journey,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I always say, they never build a statue for a critic, right?
Right.
Good stuff. Well, you know what? Let's get into. There's so many avenues we can talk about Black masculinity, but I also think we'll lead into that by giving a little background. And for those who haven't checked out, David has written a number of wonderful articles on HuffPost Canada's website. Please go check it out on Black masculinity. So let's start down that journey. How did that come about? Did they approach you? Did you approach them? How did that happen?
Yeah. So Huffington Post Canada, or HuffPost Canada, reached out to me in early 2018. An amazing editor over in the lifestyle part of Huffington Post, Lisa Young, reached out to me to possibly do a piece on Black masculinity. This was around about the time that Brandon Hay was involved in curating a event at the Harborfront Center, and I was invited to write an article for Huffington Post. I had been interviewed earlier in 2017 as part of an article series that HuffPost did on mental health. And so I was sort of invited to come back and possibly write this article. They were interested in just a short piece on Black masculinity based on the conversations that were happening through Brandon Hay's event. And so what was supposed to be initially like this very small one-off ended up expanding into something a bit larger. And I proposed having a few more conversations. In fact, I sat down with 12 men in the Black community from across, different backgrounds and experiences to get their sort of insight into what Black masculinity meant for them. Initially, I sort of felt ill-equipped to speak to or speak on behalf of Black men around what that meant. I myself was sort of figuring out and still am figuring out what that actually means. And so I thought if I invited more folks into the conversation, perhaps we could get a better picture. And so there were 12 individuals who answered that call out and contributed to this series. And so it's a 4-part series that began in 2018. We had a recent launch of the second part of that series just last month, and there are 2 more coming. And folks from, our first set of guests were on that piece was Ja Gray, a well-known local photographer whose work really explores masculinity and vulnerability. Brandon Hay, a community activator and academic and organizer who's doing some really great work through a platform called Black Daddies Club, which he founded some years ago. Travoy Deer, who is one of the originators and founders of the Black ballroom scene here in Toronto. And then more recently with this recent article, Jordan Vieira, the late Jordan Vieira, a well-known poet and community activator and activist and educator. Darren Anthony, a playwright and writer. I'm having a mind blank.
Okay, take your time.
Who is a performer and former rapper, and Mick Carter, a teacher and a stylist and designer who does some sort of gender transgressive and pushing designs for non-conforming men and folks who don't identify, non-binary folks. And so those are the sort of initial articles, and we have some amazing folks that are coming up in the next 2 installations. But the conversation was full. Like each one of them brought such rich insight into what does it mean? No one had like the perfect answer. Like, everyone sort of felt like it was a definition in discovery. Right. But I loved the opportunity to just hear from my peers around what it meant for them.
What process did you use to choose the individuals for the articles? What basis did you use? And the second part is, did anyone say no?
Yeah, some folks said no. I had a couple of folks that I reached out to who felt like it just wasn't a conversation that they felt that they wanted to be a part of. But I'll be honest, I reached out in my networks. A lot of my work over the last number of years has been in and around Black communities, and so I'm connected to a number of folks in a number of different areas. I tried to make sure that there was some representation in different arenas, and so making sure that there was a good representation of intellectuals and artists and academics and activists and folks who identified as gay, and those who were sort of gender nonconforming, those who were fathers, others who had sort of very different experiences of what it meant to be a man. I wanted to make sure that enough kinds of representations got met. But I'll be honest, I sort of swung my net within a number of circles that I was already connected to.
With the conversations you've had, were there any commonalities or themes that the men brought up, or some, maybe not all of them, but were there some common themes that were expressed by the participants in the conversations?
I think there were a number of different areas that were in common for folks. I think the first one was that it was really difficult to define, right? So I think across the board, people were like, that's a hard thing to summarize, right? Is that I think Black manhood and masculinity is such a broad and also ever evolving sort of notion, right? Like what does it mean to be a dude? What does it mean to be a man? I think that was common amongst everybody, that it was something that they were in process of figuring out. I think the other common themes that came up were around how challenging it was. However difficult to define it may be, it was also very difficult to inhabit and be. And so a lot of the responses that I got were like, it's challenging. We're not sure what this thing is, but whatever it is, it's not easy. And so that came up a lot for folks. And then I think finally, most folks also brought up this idea of like how awesome I think Black manhood and masculinity was in terms of all the possibilities that were a part of it. And so people talked a lot about being able to push the boundaries around what it meant to be a man, or expanding manhood to sort of allow for gentleness and vulnerability and transgressiveness, and redefining. I think that there was a bit of an awesome room for growth around what it meant to be a man for folks. And so that was the three common things. Still not defined, ever in process, challenging, but also really awesome and exciting. And the possibilities were some of the things that people commonly identified.
Thanks for sharing that. Were there any the hard to define part? Did any of the participants have concern about the misunderstanding around Black masculinity?
Yeah. So I think there was, and you obviously would know this too. It's the trying to figure out like how we define ourselves, right, as Black men, and then how the world defines and sees you as a Black man, and making the distinction between outside ideas and your own ideas, and sometimes how difficult that is, right, to sort of blot out outside expectations about who we are. And oftentimes the who we are that are being defined outside of ourselves that are often really limiting, right? So people talked about the constriction of outside definitions of Black manhood and masculinity. This idea of being stoic or aggressive, detached, aloof, removed, uncaring, unkind, all these sorts of scary, are things that people sort of brought up as being like these weights that they carried and oftentimes had to like shrug off in their self-definition, yeah.
Yeah, it seemed like they were saying it's almost like a two-prong attack. There's the inner, and there's the inner attack, and then there's the outer attack.
Yeah. And the tension, and the tension of fighting battles within and fighting to define self for self, and then fighting those battles without and trying to make clear the distinctions between what others are saying about who I am and how it is that I see myself.
In any of the conversations you had with the participants, did anything come up about their fathers?
A lot. And I had someone, hit me up on Instagram the other day, and he's like, I'm noticing a little theme. Like, folks are noting some not so awesome mentorship around Black manhood from fathers and, father figures. And it's funny because I actually didn't even take note of that. And I was like, oh, yeah, maybe it's true. A lot of the folks that spoke with me spoke about sort of incomplete and partial and sometimes not so helpful um, ideas about manhood from fathers and the men in their lives. Not all, some, like I think of Jordan Vieira and others who sort of spoke about having really um, positive experiences with the men in their lives, the fathers and father figures in their lives. Darren Anthony also made mention of that. But it's true. There was a lot of stories shared about just really very expansive, not very expensive like offerings by the men in their lives, And but even in that, folks being able to sort of also name that fathers and father figures can't offer what they haven't been offered, right? And so they give what they got. And if what they got was a really constricted and limited idea of what it meant to be a man, what they gave was that too.
So, based on what you just shared with us in the audience, how much of a important factor in Black masculinity is how Black men, like one of the questions I ask in what I do and when I'm helping a Black man, I always ask the question, how is or how was your relationship with your father?
Right. Yeah.
And I think, and if you want to, for me, that tells me a lot.
Okay.
Want to know your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I think our relationships to our fathers, or in some instances, the absence of relationship to our fathers, does define things for a lot of men. Um, I think of Addie Stewart's offering in the most recent article series, and he spoke about observing a really violent and womanizing example of masculinity from his father, and making this sort of internal choice to define himself in opposition to that experience, or I think about someone like Darren Anthony, who spoke about maybe not having the most full and complete example given to him by his father, but having a grandfather who showed him what it meant to be like vulnerable and gentle and caring. Um, or Travoy Deer and his offering around seeing his uncles try to define and refine his expression of his manhood and you know his femininity within his masculinity in somewhat not so helpful and toxic ways, and how his expression of himself now as a creator and a community activator being in opposition to some of those kinds of ideas that were shared with him by his uncles and the men in his life. Um, so yeah, we're always, the men in our lives, I think, always help to, the men in our childhoods, I think, often help in example or in opposition to the examples that they've given, how we define, ourselves.
Mhm.
Yeah,
You do a lot of work with Black youth. And
somewhat. Yeah,
how does this subject, if at all, how you seeing it impact them, if at all?
the conversation about
Yeah, Black masculinity.
manhood
Yeah.
and masculinity. I think we're in a moment right now where the conversations are happening around what it means to be a man in general, not just about Black manhood or masculinity. With all kinds of movements like Me Too and all of these sorts of things, men are being invited, sometimes not, to have a more fulsome examination of and conversation around what does my manhood mean, particularly in relationship to other men and to women in our lives. And I think it's causing some really great conversations, but I think in some ways sometimes it's also causing a lot of like conflict because the old sort of narratives and the boxes and the aren't as solid as they once were for folks, and that can be scary. There was a time where it was, expectations for what it meant to be a man were so rigid and so defined, even if not helpful, they were at least clear. And now, as we sort of begin to dismantle the sort of not so helpful representations of what manhood means, sometimes we're left in this sort of gray space of like, well, what does it mean? Like, and that can be really unnerving and uncomfortable. And if the only conversations that are happening, or the loudest conversations that are happening, are about quote unquote toxic masculinity, it can be really hard to sort of enter into the conversation because the major conversations that are happening around all the harmful and sometimes violent and not so helpful ways that manhood shows up. How do I, as the average Joe or Jamal, enter into that dialogue? You know what I mean? When the dialogue begins with all the ways that manhood is equated to toxicity,
Yeah, I think it's a very challenging conversation because I think, just my thoughts, masculinity on its own is good, but once that toxic part comes in the front,
Yeah.
and it seems that more people are spending more time talking about toxic masculinity than just masculinity on its own.
Right. Yeah. And I can understand why, right? Like I can understand why that portion of the conversation has become so dominant and monopolized all conversations. It's because the reality is that there's been a lot of not so great things that have happened at the hands of manhood gone wrong, right? Like we know this, that the rates of gender-based violence against women and femme folks is like, the numbers are crazy, right? The amount of like familial and domestic abuse and assaults and all these other sorts of things. We know this is real. And yet, I think that we're still in process, all of us, men, women, and everybody in between, around, well, what are other ways to honor like you said, like the beauty and the goodness that masculinity offers as well, right? Like just like femininity and everything else, there are positives and negatives. How can we acknowledge and honor the helpful things within masculine energy and manhood, while also acknowledging that there are so many things that are messy and messed up about it.
Sure. Share with us one or two special moments during the conversations you had, because I know you had many, but if there's one or two that of the many, and not say stick out, but just pick one, not that the one stick out more than the other, but one or two special moments, because I think it's a fascinating journey that you went on. Absolutely fascinating.
Or that they invited me into. Like, the reality is the heavy lifting was done by the 12 men who like gave me their time and allowed me to capture their voices and their words. And so I want to acknowledge all of their contributions because it wouldn't exist without them. There's a couple. I think about folks like Omar Rivero, who is many things, a jack of many trades, but who talked with me a lot about not only his identity as a man, but what it meant for him to also be a father in the midst of redefining his manhood and actually pushing past it, right? Like even for him, this idea of leaving behind
legacy.
Not only about legacy, but one of the things that he offered up was trying to push past manhood, and like he doesn't identify himself in that way necessarily anymore, and is able to sort of hold that truth while also being a father, and rearing a young daughter, and trying to be and offer an example of fatherhood that isn't restricted to and defined by sort of old ideas of what manhood and masculinity should and could look like. Um, I think about Ja Gray, as a photographer and a visual philosopher who speaks really candidly in his segment about his transition, and how that's afforded him a different kind of insight in what it means to be a man, because of his history. And then I think of Jordan, Jordan Vieira, uh, and speaking about how he sort of revisited his ideas of what it meant to be a man when faced with, at the time, his chronic health issues, and being faced with his mortality had to have him redefine for himself what it meant to be a man. Jordan passed away before his piece could get published, but it's almost haunting how that kid was so so wise and had an insight that listening back on some of his interview, just was like, wow, this kid knew so much with just 26 years under his belt, and left behind a legacy that I think will extend for a while. And so those were some of the folks that stood out to me, amongst many others.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but just off the top of my head, those three folks come to mind.
How has doing this series impacted you?
My whole life, I think, I've been in process around what it means to be a man, a Black man in particular. I really, in my childhood, struggled with ideas of manhood, and even for a time questioned even if I was a man. Um, and so it was interesting to hear other men from such very different backgrounds than me in some instances speak about how those struggles were universal. Like, I thought it was just my own experience being queer and having some gender questions and confusions early into my life, and realizing actually across the board there, it seems like men of all different backgrounds and locations have had questions about what does this freaking mean. And so I think I felt not so alone after these interviews. I'm like, oh, we all are trying to figure it out. Oh, okay, none of us know what the hell is going on. Awesome. I thought I was a bit of an alien, and I'm not. We're all trying to figure this bloody thing out. And so that's the big takeaway, I think, for me over the course of the last 2 years.
With the world as it is today, is trying to figure it out getting any easier? What body language?
No, like I said, right, we're in this deconstructing period, right? We're in this tearing down period, that all the sort of old institutions and ideologies are being troubled and challenged. Great. Because we know that there's a lot of old things, ideas, institutions, traditions that just didn't and no longer work.
Right.
And in the tearing down, that's bloody scary, because not many folks have offered up or ushered in yet the alternatives. We're still figuring out, okay, like, we know that this doesn't work, or these particular things of the old no longer work. What the hell is going to replace that? And I think that that's a scary and confusing place to be. And that's not just around the conversation about what it means to be a man. We're seeing that happen in society at large. Like, what does it mean to just be? Religion, is being challenged. Governments are being challenged. National and cultural identity is being challenged. Gender is being challenged. And everybody's going, there's a comfort in even in the like restrictive and constrictive old ways of being. And sometimes during these times of challenge and during these times of upheaval, there's a tendency for some of us to sort of revert back to old ways of being, right? And so conservatism of all sorts, religious conservatism, social conservatism, all kinds of conservatisms, end up re-emerging with a force and a vengeance, because at least within those ways of being, there's some knowns or seeming knowns. I wouldn't say that they're actual knowns, but they seem familiar and solid. And so this is a scary, confusing time. But in the midst of the scary and confusing, there's so much possibility too, if only like we leave space for that, you know?
So as we start winding down the conversation, I'd like to know, I always like to, as much as possible, end off with calls to action.
Mm.
So when it comes to Black masculinity, what is your message for those who are not Black
Mm.
when it comes to Black masculinity?
My commentary for those who aren't Black. So I know that the question that often comes up is, well, what's the difference? What's the difference between Black masculinity and every other mask? And I think that because of what being Black has come to mean in the world, and for all of the not so helpful and negative things that Blackness has come to mean, Black manhood has always had to move through that really tight and confining box that is Blackness by the outside world. And so if manhood and masculinity has been very restrictive and constrictive for everybody, it's been even more so a tight fit for Black men, because we already exist in a box that the outside has placed on who we are and how we should show up. And so what I would say to folks around Black masculinity is that Black masculinity, like all masculinities, is, hard to pin down and ever evolving and difficult to define. And where it is defined, limiting. But because of the limitations that Blackness has been forced on those of us of African descent, our expressions of manhood have been equally as narrow. And so the work around expanding that, the work around breaking out of boxes and redefining, and it's so much more of a heavier lift. And so if there's anything, what is Black masculinity? It's a bloody, difficult, ever evolving, challenging notion and idea that Black men are in the process of figuring out.
Okay. The next group I'd like you to give a call to action to when it comes to Black masculinity is Black women.
I think it doesn't change. Okay. And I've been part of conversations recently where I've heard, particularly from my straight brothers, the same sort of thing is making clear that for as much as Black masculinity and manhood has not always been super helpful for Black women, remembering that for Black men it's as equally as challenging and damaging and harmful, right? Is that if there's ever been a need for like compassion for Black men in this process of redefining self in this ever-changing world, it's now. While still being able to hold the truth of the fact that, Black men haven't always been super great in all instances to Black women. We can hold those two truths at the same time. Black manhood hasn't always been awesome for Black women at all times, but that there's a need for grace and space and holding Black men in a place of compassion as we all figure this bloody thing out. Okay.
And then finally, what's your message to Black men when it comes to Black masculinity?
Keep pushing, keep pushing yourself, keep pushing others to not be limited by the things that we've been taught about who it is that we should be and how we should show up. Allow yourself to be transgressive in whatever ways if that means in terms of showing your vulnerability, if that means how you parent your own kids, if that means how you are in partnership with the women or men in your life, keep pushing yourself beyond old ideals, even when you don't know what that looks like at all times. You know.
Good stuff. Well, I'd like to thank you for taking time out of your positive, productive schedule to share with us. What's up next for you on the journey?
I'm writing. So I'm in the process of doing some writing work and working on a book of poetry and completing up a residency with a theater company in the city and trying to, share stories of Black folks and folks of color and queer folks and myself through story. And so that's what I'm involved in right now.
Excellent. If people want to get in contact with you, how can they do that?
Twitter, Facebook, David Lewis Peart on all those platforms. Shoot me a message and let me know that you're interested in having a dialogue and I'm around. So I do a lot of teaching in the city and so come out to a workshop or one of my classes and
all right. Fantastic. Well, thanks again, David. We'll put up all that contact information where people can reach out to you on the repost of this epic conversation. I am Dr. Vibe here, host and producer of the award-winning Dr. Vibe Show, the home of epic conversations. I'm the host of Epic Conversations 2018 Innovation Award winner given out by the Canadian Ethnic Media Association. I'd like to say thank you for everyone who watched or listened to this live or on the replay. It's appreciated and not taken for granted. As always, I like to close out my conversations like this. Live your life as a dream. If you can dream it, you can make it. Sometimes you have to get smaller to get stronger. Block assumptions and then aim bigger, aim better, aim higher, aim wider. And if you want to find out about me, the best place to do is go to the website. Go to my website, thedrvibeshow.com. God bless, peace be well, keep the faith, and walk good. Good night, everybody.